Hello, and welcome to Radical Behaviorism. Today, we will be starting with the history of radical behaviorism. But before we dive into that, I want to talk to you a little bit about what the PIMs are going to look like this term. So, the PIM structure for this term is slightly different from your other courses. Usually, the program instruction module is designed robustly around the readings of the week and generally the topic of the week as well. So you're typically instructed to do the PIM after the reading. In this class, we're going to do it a little differently. You're going to do the PIM first because the PIMs in this course are designed to orient you towards the topic and readings of the week. So basically, they are designed to give you a snapshot of what to expect because the readings in this class are pretty intense. Um, so the PIMs are designed to sort of give you the lay of the land, an outline just for you to figure out or sort of be prepared when you go into those readings. So the PIMs, therefore, are not a substitute for reading the articles or reading any other chapters you've been assigned, blog posts, listening to podcast episodes, watching videos. Everything that's in your syllabus is meant to be read and covered. Not only does it affect your grades significantly, but it also contributes a whole lot to the discussion in the classroom. So please make sure that you get all your readings done each week. So now coming to this week. This week we're going to cover sort of a very basic history of how radical behaviorism came to be. So the class is called Radical Behaviorism, and we're going to talk about how that happened. So of course, I'm sure the name Pavlov is familiar. So Ivan Pavlov, a Russian scientist, sort of is considered the one of the his work is considered one of the origins of um, modern day behaviorism. So like any story worth its salt in history, this one begins with dogs. Pavlov observed that his dogs were drooling even when he walked into a room without their food, um, and thought it was an interesting endeavor and decided to run some experiments with it. So he ran some experiments and discovered or basically labeled what we now know as a stimulus or an environmental variable that has some relationship with behavior. So by repeatedly pairing a unconditioned stimulus like food with a neutral stimulus like a bell, Pavlov observed that the dogs began salivating. Pavlov observed that the dogs began salivating. Um, Eventually, with just the presentation of the bell without the food. So essentially, the bell went from being a neutral stimulus to becoming conditioned to elicit a specific response of drooling. And we now know this to be classical or respondent conditioning. And I'm sure that's familiar to you from ABA 500. And then, of course, a big name in our history is Dr. John B. Watson. He was a very prominent psychologist who believed that psychology should be a science. And therefore, in order for psychology to be a science, it had to be based on observable and measurable events. In his case, overt behavior. So he had already rejected Thorndike's law of effect study, which is basically a trial and error learning theory that was sort of a precursor to Skinner's reinforcement principles, because he believed that there were unnecessary subjective elements that prohibited it from being a scientific study of behavior. So Watson firmly believed that in order for in order for psychology to be a science, that the first thing that was necessary for the field to do was to discard any reference to consciousness and other mental states as the object of observation, because he believed that the field had become so enmeshed in what he calls speculative questions about the elements of the mind that he, as an experimental student, could not abide by sort of the problems that were developing by relying on sort of these quote unquote inner and quote unquote outer states. And so he decreed that the only way for any objective measurement to occur was by recording and monitoring observable events. And according to Watson, that meant overt behaviors. So Watson was one of the first ones. Interestingly, Watson coined not only behaviorism and called himself a behaviorist, but he did call what he did, or what his work, he called it radical behaviorism, which is interesting because that's not what we know it to be today. But yeah, he called it radical behaviorism, and in fact, very famously is known to have said the statement about giving him a dozen infants who were well-formed and his own specified world, and he could guarantee that he could take any one of them and train them to become whatever specialist that he selected, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. So Watson very famously has said that, which basically again alluded to his very firm belief, or firm, well, belief, I guess, is the right word at this point, but his firm belief and stance that in order for us to conduct any sort of scientific analysis on the human condition, we needed to reject anything that was not directly observable. So what makes behaviorism radical as we know it right now? There was definitely a shift from when Skinner entered the game. Skinner's radical behaviorism is not the same as what Watson called radical behaviorism. And in fact, Skinner went on to even coin a different term for what Watson was doing, which he called methodological behaviorism. Skinner essentially, so Watson's work sort of died out in the late 30s, and there was a lot of stuff written about how there was a rise and fall of behaviorism, or a philosophy of behaviorism. So the field at large in general thought that the notion would die out and psychology would go back to what it was. And along came Skinner, or man Skinner, who not only took elements of what Watson was saying and ran with it, but essentially entirely gave us our underlying philosophy of the work that we do even today. So everything that you do in applied behavior analysis today comes from Skinner's extensive philosophical underpinnings of radical behaviorism. So primarily, Skinner spent a lot of time analyzing what was commonly understood to be cause and effect. And he has a lot of interesting things to say about what we understand as causal, and coined the term functional relation. So we'll definitely be talking more about this in class. But yeah, our more contemporary understanding of cause and effect, or contemporary understanding of behavior and environment, often gets a little murky, and we start to think about things as cause and effect. But really what Skinner was talking about when he said cause or causal was a functional relation. A functional relation which is essentially a covariation of observables in a system, or essentially that relationship, that continually evolving, continually sort of fluctuating relationship between elements of a behavior and the context that it is in. That is what Skinner coined as the functional relation, and that is what we consider the functional relation as well. So Skinner's big couple of things that Skinner did that were really radical, and hence we call Skinnerian behaviorism radical behaviorism, are one, he emphasized a lot about an underlying philosophy versus practice. Two, he rejected Watson's notion that private events, or what we now label private events, or what Skinner labeled private events, and that included verbal behavior, still very much falls within the paradigm or the analysis of behavior from our philosophy and perspective as we know it. So those were two big contributions of B.F. Skinner, or the verb behavior and the treatment of private events, which is where he sort of really deviated from what Watson had set down as a consideration of behaviorism. You will be reading this paper later along in the term, but he wrote a seminal paper called The Operational Analysis of Psychological Terms, where he made the case for why all of the things that Watson said should be rejected in a scientific study of behavior actually need not be, because they still very much fall within our paradigm.
Well, I mean, the behavior is indeed the behavior of a physical organism. We are just organisms, and our behavior is chemically, physically, otherwise completely determined by our genetic endowment, what has happened in the history of the species, and what has happened to us as individuals since birth, and what the present situation we find ourselves in. And our behavior then, I think, can be shown to be a product of that. And that is determined. It doesn't mean that we are unable to do things about our own behavior, because we are. We're able to change the world in which we live and thus change our own behavior. I believe in self-control, but only because we have been taught how to control ourselves.
How do we control ourselves?
Well, by doing what we would do to control someone else, which is to manipulate the environment. Rather than just go with an act of will, we change the world in which we live, and if we're successful and skillful, we can change our behavior.
So what is all this about? Why should you care what our philosophy is? Or why should you care about a philosophy at all? Very simply, because our field's gotten really big, and that may not seem relevant quite directly, but our field's gotten really big, and our field's gotten really big in order to meet a drastic increase in the demand for our services. And while there's a lot of complicated machinations for why those services have increased in the first place, essentially, we're churning out a bunch of behavior analysts. And we need to make sure that we maintain our scientific rigor while we do so. So regardless of whether you go for a doctorate in the future that requires you to have some philosophical study and knowledge, even as practitioners, it's really important. It's really important to have a very clear understanding of the perspective with which you approach your work. There's a reason that we pride ourselves in being able to make measurable and meaningful change because of the technology that we use. But it's also important for us to know where that technology comes from and what it is based on, and how does that impact your day-to-day work as a practitioner. Some other reasons you should probably care are because despite our sort of acceptance and understanding that the philosophy or science of behaviorism can be implemented to literally any behavior. Look at where our field's at. We do so many things, and so many of those things are related to human services, which means that we have a responsibility to make sure that what we're doing in service to other humans has a solid basis, and that basis means having a solid understanding of what we do. It's not enough for you to convince a bunch of other folks, but it's important for you to develop a critical and the capacity to critically analyze what you're doing and why you're doing it. And one of the ways to do that is to have a strong foundational understanding of why you make the decisions that you do in your job, or why does your BCBA make the decisions they do in their jobs. Because you're responsible, first and foremost, of course, you're a client, but you're also responsible to a whole other bunch of people as practitioners. So while it may seem a little bit over the top, I think there's a lot of good reasons why we should probably be doing this and doing it well and doing it robustly. So that's why we have this class. Skinner said this back in 1953 in the throes of building an entire new field. I'd like you to think about this for a moment and think about what this actually means and how can we make this happen? And what does that have to do with what we're trying to learn in this class? Some more food for thought while you go into your readings. Think about what it means for radical behaviorism to be thoroughgoing. Regardless of what I have to say, do you think it's useful to understand an underlying philosophy of our work? Do you think it impacts our effectiveness? How can we as practitioners adhere to our ethical codes when we follow the guidelines of radical behaviorism? Do you foresee places in which they may clash? And does this philosophical perspective have its downsides? What's the flip side of adopting this philosophy? What's the flip side of looking at behavior environment and environmental interactions, or looking for a functional relation? What does that mean in theory versus what does that look like in practice?